Good
Hello.
evening, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar titled The Future of Tibetan Leadership, Insights on His Holiness, the Dalai Lama Succession. My name is Nupur Hasija, and as a Senior Program Manager at the South Asia Regional Office of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, I'm delighted to have you all with us for what promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. The Friedrich-Naumann Foundation is a German political foundation dedicated to the advancing liberal values, including good governance, the rule of law, education, and market economy. We support these principles through political consultancy, dialogue, and civic education. At FNF South Asia, we take pride in facilitating discussions on issues that are vital to the region, contributing to global conversations about the challenges and perspectives shaping South Asia today. This webinar is one of the key platforms through which we engage in this important dialogue, and I believe it is especially timely. As we approach His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama 90th birthday next year, a milestone of great significance for the Tibetan community and beyond, questions around his succession have taken center stage, both within the community and on international stage. It is a topic that invites reflection on the future of Tibetan leadership and its role in shaping the identity of the Tibetan people. Before we begin the panel discussion and hear from our distinguished speakers, we would like to show a short video highlighting our long-standing partnership with the Central Tibetan Administration, with whom we have worked since 1991 to strengthen democratic processes within the Tibetan community.
The Tibetan government in exile is primarily the democratic government in exile. We lost our country in 1959. Right from our first step inside the exile community, His Holiness always have the vision of democratizing the Tibetan governing system and Tibetan way of life. So that itself is the starting of the democratic, the parliament in exile.
I think the relationship between the Tibetan Parliament in exile and the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung started around 1991.
FNF collaboration is in making the democratic system deep-rooted in not only in the parliament but also at the grassroots level.
This partnership is so extremely important because we are deeply convinced that the Tibetan cause is a very democratic, a very liberal, a very positive cause. It's a model for many organizations around the globe for a very peaceful approach.
They have been very helpful in introducing the Tibetan situation to many other countries, other people.
Unless we reach out and tell our story, nobody is going to come to us and ask us what's your story. So that has been made available by FNF.
The key highlight for me is to see that we share the same values, that we share the miracle of democracy, what it means to fight for open society and awareness for democracy. This is absolutely amazing.
We considered, of course, we want to go back to Tibet and then a free Tibet, where Tibetans will have the freedom to live as a way they want to live, use their language, practice their religion, and preserve their environment. And that's what we want.
My vision for the future generations of Tibet is to have freedom, to have liberty in your thought and speech. We can have a better world where everybody's imagination and everybody's dream could be fulfilled.
Thank you so much for this video, Nils. Now I have the pleasure to share a message from Mrs. Sandra Wieser, Member of Parliament in Germany, who is unable to join us live today due to her duties ahead of upcoming elections in Germany. Mrs. Wieser, a German-French politician from the Free Democratic Party, has been a member of Bundestag since 2017. We are deeply grateful for her continued support of the Tibetan cause. Can we have the video, please?
It's a great privilege to speak to you today on a topic of profound importance to the Tibetan community and to all those who stand for peace, democracy, and human rights around the world. As many of you know, next year, His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, will celebrate his 90th birthday. This milestone is not just a moment for the Tibetan people to reflect on the profound impact of His Holiness's leadership, but also an opportunity for us as members of the international community to reflect on the future of Tibetan leadership and the challenges that lie ahead. As we look to the future, we face crucial questions regarding his succession. What comes next? How will Tibetans, both in exile and within Tibet, navigate their path ahead? These questions are all the more pressing given the geopolitical realities of the region, particularly with China's increasing interference in Tibetan religious affairs. During my visit to Dharamsala last year, I had the opportunity to meet with members of the Central Tibetan administration, to speak with exiled Tibetans, and to witness firsthand the deep sense of resilience and hope that still characterizes the Tibetan struggle for autonomy. What stood out to me most during that visit was the unwavering commitment to His Holiness's leadership, but also the understanding that the future has to be prepared. Tibetans, while united in their admiration for His Holiness, recognize that the transition of the leadership is inevitable. The international community, Europe, and particularly Germany, have a responsibility to stand alongside the Tibetan people, advocating for the rights and ensuring that their voice remains heard. As policymakers, it's our duty to ensure that the Tibetan cause is not forgotten. Moreover, we must be vigilant in ensuring that the process of succession remains free from external interference. The Chinese government's attempt to control the reincarnation process of Tibetan spiritual leaders are a direct violation of Tibetan religious freedom. The freedom to choose their spiritual and political leaders is a fundamental right of the Tibetan people, and it must be protected. As I conclude, let us remember that the question of leadership is not about filling a role, it is about preserving the values of Tibetans. The path ahead is not clear, but the Tibetan people have shown time and again their strength, resilience, and unwavering commitment to the cause. Let us stand with them as allies in a fight for a free and peaceful Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Wieser, for the inspiring message. We are also honored to receive a recorded message from Sikyong Penpa Sering, the elected president of the Central Tibetan Administration, who will offer his valuable insights on the future of Tibetan leadership.
Many greetings to all the participants of this conference. I regret to say that I'm traveling right now in Europe and that I could not be personally present at the conference. But I'm also thankful to the Foundation for organizing this conference with very eminent speakers. And I hope through this exercise there would be more awareness on His Holiness reincarnation and what the Chinese are trying to do and what we Tibetans are trying to do here. Of course, the Chinese government is not bothered about the living 15th Dalai Lama, living 14th Dalai Lama, but they are more concerned about the yet to come 15th Dalai Lama, because they know that they can control the Tibetan people if they can control the next Dalai Lama. So I think the best suggestion would be that I read out a statement that this present cabinet, the 16th cabinet, has issued on 29 September 2022 regarding His Holiness reincarnation ad verbatim. This is what was in the public domain. This is Kashak's position on the issue of reincarnation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. The government of the People's Republic of China adopted the so-called law on management measures for the reincarnation of living Buddhas in Tibetan Buddhism in 2007. Since then, the PRC has taken over the management of all monastic administration, and in particular took complete control over the power to recognize reincarnated lamas, or what they refer to as living Buddhas, and continue to use it to meet their political ends. Moreover, the PRC government in real time conducts workshops, discussion forums, talk shows, and uses various means to promote a false narrative on the issue of reincarnation in general, and in the reincarnation of the present Dalai Lama in particular. These activities are conducted on all the ordained monks and laity throughout Tibet. It is also a fact that the issue of reincarnation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama continues to be discussed within our community and without as well. Therefore, the Kashak, or the cabinet of the Central Tibetan Administration, which you refer to as the government in exile, felt the need to present this position paper for everyone's information. Number one, the Kashak has firm belief that His Holiness will live to the ripe age of 113 as per propitious prescience and the repeated assurance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Number two, the system of recognizing reincarnated spiritual beings is a religious practice unique to Tibetan Buddhism. The fundamental thought behind this philosophy is to accept the principle of life after death. And the purpose of reincarnation is for the previous Lama to reincarnate and come into a new life form to serve what has been left behind by the former Lama. Then, number three, while extending our sincere appreciation and thankfulness to those freedom-loving democratic countries around the world, including the United States of America, for their complete endorsement of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's thoughts on this matter, we will pursue with due diligence to obtain similar support from as many like-minded countries as possible. Then number four is with regard to the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness has repeatedly mentioned or stated since 1989 the official pronouncement of September 24, 2011, or any guidance in future is inherently discretionary. No government nor any individual has the right to interfere on this matter. Number five, the religious activity should be conducted as per the responsibilities that His Holiness enshrines and entrusts. We have full confidence in the leadership of the Central Tibetan Administration at the time to take responsibility as entrusted. Number six, the Kashak is in the process of working on other related matters that need to be addressed concerning this issue. So these are the 6 position points that we have mentioned in the year 2022, and this continues to be our position. And based on this position, I'm sure the other speakers will also deliberate on other angles that has to do with the conversation or the discourse concerning His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and his reincarnation. So I wish this conference all the best.
Thank you, Penpala. Lastly, it's my pleasure to introduce today's esteemed moderator, Ms. Dr. Anna Savarthal. Ms. Savarthal is an editor at the Standard, one of the Austria's leading daily newspapers, where she focuses on Asian affairs for the international desk. She holds an MA in Tibetan and Buddhist studies from the University of Vienna and earned her PhD at the Research Center Asia and Europe in a global context at Heidelberg University. We're fortunate to have her expertise guiding today's conversation. Thank you, Anna, moderating this important discussion. Without further ado, I will now hand over the proceedings to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nupula, Tocheche, and Jashidele, to everybody. It's really a great pleasure to moderate this really important and timely panel today. We've already heard in the auspicious and eminent videos, we've already touched upon a few topics that we will definitely discuss today. And thank you also to the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung in general to give room to this kind of discussion. So we will talk today about the future of Tibetan leadership, insights in His Holiness the Dalai Lama's succession. And it's a really great pleasure to host a very distinguished panel today on this topic. First, I would like to introduce to you Geshe Lakdola. Many of you, I'm sure, know him as famously the director of the very important institution, the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. Geshe-la has been a religious assistant and translator to His Holiness for 16 years. And apart from holding, of course, the highest degree of traditional Tibetan academic standards, the Geshe degree, he also holds various master degrees and as honorary professor, for example, of the University of British Columbia and also Delhi University. Also, I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Anand Kumar. He is educated at Benares Hindu University and at the University of Chicago. He has a visiting professorship at 6 foreign and 7 Indian universities. And of course, he's the author and of famous books and edited also several books in Hindi and also in English, including the important work Tibet Sourcebook. And of course, he's president of the India-Tibet Friendship Society. Thirdly, I'm very happy to introduce to you Chemi Lhamo. She's a Tibetan-Canadian activist and the Canadian representative for the International Tibet Network Steering Committee. Her work and activism have landed her in the Maclean Top 50 Power List of Canada 2020. She has also received the 2020 Global Icon of Tibetan Youth Award and the 2022 Urban Hero Award. So a very accomplished activist. And last but not least, it's great to see again Tenzin Desela. He's a senior researcher at the Tibet Policy Institute, Dharamsala. He's a trained anthropologist, actually, with a lot of fieldwork experience, also among the exiled Tibetan population. He's also the editor of the Journal of the Tibet Policy Institute. And he's a very active member of the academic community worldwide, which we can see also in the fact that he's an elected member of the Board of Advisors of the International Seminar of Young Tibetologists. So I think from all these 4 panelists, we will be able to get a very broad idea on the topic that we're discussing today from various angles. And I would like to start by asking the Venerable Geshe Lakdola if maybe he can briefly give us a bit of a concise overview of how the traditional beliefs surrounding reincarnation in Tibet actually work and why it is particularly important in the case of His Holiness. Geshe-la.
Okay.
First of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, led by my friend Glenn, who I meet almost 2-3 times in a year. And I know your organization has been working consistently and rigorously and actively for the Tibetan cause for many, many years. So I would like to express my appreciation. For shortage of time, I may not be able to go into the depth of the process of reincarnation, but since this meeting is not just for the participant, but it is to be viewed by others, so I would like to just underline some basic rules why this concept of reincarnation is important. This is especially important not only for the Tibetans, but it is important in today's world, because today we are living in a materialistic world where the focus is primarily on the material things, and there is really not much understanding about the importance of human mind. Although we do talk about mind, but we don't even scratch the surface of what mind is, what emotion is, what, the role it is played by this emotion and human mind. And I want to stress the importance of the point that Tibet is perhaps the only country living in the world who spend their whole energy, not for 1 year, not for 100 years, for several thousands of years, how to understand, discover the inner human resources and how to preserve it and protect it. So we know the best what it means to reincarnate and the importance of reincarnation, especially of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Just for the layman's understanding, if I give you an example, tonight when you go to bed, your body is more or less dead. More or less, I'm not saying you're dead, but more or less you're dead. But your mind becomes even more active. That shows the possibilities of the continuity of the mind. Just to give you a small kind of hint or a possibility. Now, in this context, China, one of the most extreme materialistic, where freedom is restricted, everything is to be done in accordance with the dictates of the great helmsman, right? And who has really, honestly speaking, of all people, has the least understanding about human mind, and who does not believe religion. And now talking about recognizing the reincarnation of His Holiness Dalai Lama, which they already did with the Panchen Lama. Now they want to do this, and the Chinese have been doing this since a long time, since the Manchu time of Manchu. They have clearly seen that Tibetans follow religion. They have a lot of faith to the Lama, so thereby they saw, okay, it's important to, get some of the high Lamas reincarnation recognized, so that they'll become our pawn in our hand, and we can manipulate them. That has been there for many, many years. Now with this dictatorial, government, it is even more rigorous. It is more rigorous. So, but they may think that they are very clever, but for the rest of the international people, for at least people like me, they are absolutely stupid. They are making a mockery of the basic intelligence and common sense of human being. On the one hand, you try to destroy everything that represents people's identity, spirituality, things like that. Then at the same time, you jump in and say, okay, we are going to recognize His Holiness the Dalai Lama's reincarnation and the reincarnation of many Lamas. And in this context, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, if you are really, really interested in recognizing reincarnation, why don't you recognize the reincarnation of Mao Zedong? Because you don't need to follow any system, any rule, do whatever you like. So you can say Mao Zedong was so great, now he came back as a great reincarnation, and then start praying to him. So what they are doing is really not worth even discussing. So short-sighted, so stupid, and so, shameless. So I don't even want to talk about it. Now, in the case of usefulness of reincarnation, it is not just, this time or last year. Since thousands of years, since we introduced this system of reincarnation, which is actually there in the teaching of the Buddha himself, that he reincarnated in many forms to serve all sentient beings. So the root is there. So if you go back with all these systems of reincarnation, you can clearly see how these great teachers, like His Holiness, how much they have contributed to the well-being of not only Tibetans, but people all over the world. Now, in the case of His Holiness, I don't have to explain this. We know how much His Holiness has contributed to the peace, harmony, and well-being of everybody. So therefore, recognizing his reincarnation is, of course, very, very important. But I want to conclude, there's not much time. I want to conclude and say that it is none of the business of anybody except His Holiness or those institutions and Buddhist practitioners who follow His Holiness. No one else has the responsibility. And China, of course, the most worthless candidate in this case. They have no right at all to recognize His Holiness reincarnation. Even if they try to do it, nobody will follow it. Some people might follow it as they are afraid of the dictatorial system, but otherwise nobody will follow it, as is happened with the Parkdale Lama. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Geshe-la. Maybe one follow-up question. You've mentioned the case of His Holiness the Panchen Lama. How has the issue or the problem that the Chinese made in the 90s about the Panchen Lama, how does it affect the way that maybe Tibetan community and especially maybe Tibetan clergy prepare for nowadays when it comes to reincarnation of very high
challenges
Lama?
are always there. Even without Chinese interruption, challenges are always there, because as and when we talk about mind, it's very confusing, So people normally don't believe in future life, past life. So but because these questions are arising, you see, I have this book with me. 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation. This is scientific finding, right? And then look at this book, where reincarnation and biology intersect. So it is not like Tibetans with blind faith talking about reincarnation. Now there are hundreds and thousands of cases of people who are able to remember their past reincarnation. So that is one thing. Then, as you mentioned, as you asked, there will always be disturbances. I mean, the whole country, the Tibet has been gobbled up, and everything that represents Tibetan identity, Tibetan uniqueness, Tibetan culture, they are trying to do away with it, including the name of Tibet. So I'm not surprised what they are going to do. The important thing for us is how to gather support, from the rest of the country, as the US and others have clearly mentioned that this is business of Tibetan people and His Holiness, and it's business of nobody else. So that is it. So we are ready to encounter any shameless intervention from the Chinese government, but we are ready to confront it, because they have no logic, no reason. They will only use gun to silence the mouth of the people, and that will be short-lived.
Professor Kuma, it's great to have you here as well. You've been studying and been very involved in the Tibet issue and the Tibetan community. I was wondering if you could maybe give us an idea of how the succession of His Holiness presents challenges, but also how it is looked at from an Indian perspective. Of course, India has been a generous host to the Tibetan community for almost 70 years. What questions arise in the context? Sorry, Professor Kuma, you're still muted.
Sound.
Mute.
I thank you, Mishana, to join all of us in this very important dialogue. And as you started with presentation by one of the geshes to give us the traditional understanding of the situation, I think that for last 15 years or so, the Dalai Lama has been very careful in making himself limited to only spiritual presence. He has created a system of gradual transfer of power. So the secular questions are now totally under the command of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. And that has been accepted by the Indian government and most of the global powers when they receive Kolon Tripa with due courtesy, and they are not cross-checking with the Dalai Lama about anything and everything which is coming to them as a decision of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. So that's one very important development in last 15 years or so. And that's very scientific, rational, secular solution of the problem which will emerge with the physical passing away of the person, the 14th Dalai Lama. Emotionally, the Indian people have been accustomed to identify Dalai Lama with Tibet and Tibet with Dalai Lama. We are always giving highest importance to the position taken by the Dalai Lama on anything, whether it was the case of Panchen Lama or it was case with the claims of the Chinese of developing and modernizing Tibet. Whenever there is a report coming from Beijing, it is contrasted with the report coming from Dharamsala, and Dharamsala is given more legitimacy. One good thing about the present image of Tibet is that people of India, officials, public intellectuals, and neutral people know that Chinese are not telling the truth. So that claim of China to represent the truth is always taken with a pinch of salt. And one good thing about the Tibetans in exile has been that they have been always presenting their story with the basis of facts. They were not using any subjective interpretation of the situation. There has been never maligning or stigmatizing of the Chinese people. And there has been very careful distinction between the people of China and the policy makers of China. Yes, there will be a huge challenge before the Tibetan community in exile to remain united and active and consistent in the absence of the present Dalai Lama. And that is something which they have to work out. But so far as we are concerned as friends of Tibet, supporters of Tibetan initiative to say secure their identity, to protect their culture, there will be a proper continuity, because in case of India, the question of Tibet has become a general national consensus, whether it is party A in power or party B in power. They have maintained a clear line of supporting the Tibetan cause without moving in the direction of war or violence. So we are very worried about the scenario beyond the present Dalai Lama, but we are quite confident that given the present level of decentering himself, there will be quite a continuity. It is also interesting to let you know that even the spiritual role of the Dalai Lama is gradually being transferred to people like Professor Samdang Rinpoche and some of the other scholars. So the institutional structure which has been created by the Tibetans in exile under the guidance of Dalai Lama, the monasteries, the places where policies are being made, the religious continuities, they are all giving us a little of autonomy. And the Dalai Lama is not indispensable, there is no doubt about it. He is so unique, but at the same time, there will be not a collapse of the Tibetan cause. But we have to work out more rational strategies. And I think that this dialogue is one of the first initiatives where the Tibetan leadership, Tibetan spiritual icons, and the friends of Tibet, people like you and me, are being together to put our thoughts together to know what are going to be the challenges and how to make up for that. Yes, it is also a big problem that the Chinese will be going all out with their propaganda machine, and they may try to swing the public opinion. But as it is, China has a very low legitimacy level. They are not known to be very truthful. So between China and the Tibetans in exile, people of India will prefer to trust the Tibetans in exile. Now it will be on the it will be on the shoulders of the Tibetans in exile to maintain a very, you can say, balanced communication between themselves, within themselves, and between them and rest of us, particularly the Indians in exile, Indians in support of the people in exile.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. I mean, everything, taking everything into consideration that you said, especially about how the power between spiritual and worldly leadership, of course, had been already taken away or given away in 2011, but also now, also some spiritual responsibility dividing amongst other high clergy. Still, do you think India can contribute in some way to a smooth process of transition? Is there some role that India or Indian people, Indian government on any level could play in order to help or to contribute to somehow to a smooth process of transition?
Most certainly, Indian government so far has been very consistent in following a line of what the Dalai Lama says, cautious concern about Tibet. They have not supported the Tibetan cause in open, in totality, but at the same time, they have not allowed the Chinese propaganda to overwhelm them. So they are standing in between China and the supporters of Tibet, like European Union and in a way American Senate. So if the government of India, particularly our Foreign Office, decides to maintain the same level of visibility and connectivity with the Tibetans in exile and themselves as they have maintained all these years, they have also ignored some of the pressures from the Chinese against the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans in exile. If there is no discontinuity in the Indian policy system, there will be no problem in terms of the support which is across political parties, non-party, national consensus that Tibet has been wrong. That will not be disturbed. But yes, there may be a crisis if our Foreign Office becomes tongue-tied, becomes nervous, and becomes a partner in creating confusion. And I'm sure that given the present situation as we have in Ladakh, in Galwan Valley, we know the truth of the Chinese design, and we have become a little more convinced about the need to be more proactive about national security, which is also supporting the Tibetan cause.
And one follow-up to that, I mean, the recent disengagement or the recent progress made on the border issue between China and India, between Delhi and Beijing, do you see that this could lead to a bit more reluctance on the Delhi side, or to remain maybe more silent when it comes to the Tibet issue? Do you see a connection there, or some worries?
Yes, I see more space being created for reviewing our Tibet policy, our security policy. So far, as the Dalai Lama says, Indian foreign policy establishment has been overcautious. But now with Galwan Valley tragedy and the unfair dealings of the Chinese, there is going to be more openness to what the Tibetans expect from India to publicly stand for. There is much more, I must say, much more awareness about the tragedy called Tibet and the problem called People's Republic of China.
Great, thank you very much. Great. Chemi Lhamo, you're joining us here from Canada. It's a pleasure to have you. Could you share with us where discussions on succession stand at the moment in a kind of faraway diaspora country like in Canada, and how you observe how the international community can help or can position itself in regard to succession questions? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, for the question. In regards to the international community, The international community must, one, recognize, and two, pass legislation to preemptively support and solidify that support. Because the CCP, the Chinese government, is what they're seeking is control and legitimacy, both internally and externally. And if they don't get that, what they seek to assert is their narrative and create confusion, which is where exactly the international community comes in with clarity by understanding and recognizing how outrageous it sounds for the Chinese government to even involve itself with the reincarnation conversation, forget deciding. So taken for a moment, the Venezuelan government is going to announce today that they are going to decide who the next pope is. How ridiculous does that sound, right? And for the selection of the pope, there is actually a degree of election by the College of Cardinals. But for the reincarnation process, it is not only a religious process, it is a very personal one. And so there is absolutely no room for the political and colonial entities such as the Chinese government in this process. Not only that, they're not even fit to do so. The Chinese government is actually a regime that for over 70 years has been and is currently actively destroying every aspect of the Tibetan identity and fabric of the Tibetan identity, whether it's political, religious, social existence, so much that the UN experts have recently called for the abolishment of the coerced residential school system that has separated nearly 1 million Tibetan children from their families. Today is actually November 20th, marking the World's Children Day. And just imagine for a second, children as young as 4 years old are being separated from their families and being taught how to read, write, and even think in Chinese instead of Tibetan. And so this very regime that is capable of doing deploying such insidious tactics on the Tibetan people, the destroyer of the culture and identity of these people, how can they even try to speak to the people? Let alone decide the future of our spiritual figure. And so that speaks to a little bit about how the diaspora community also feels on this, because they absolutely the Chinese government has no right in this conversation. And the international community must recognize and also pass legislation that embodies that. And we've seen that happen in the US with the Tibet Support and Policy Act in 2020. So it's been done before. And it's also explicitly mentioned that any intervention by the Chinese government will result in consequences such as sanctions and such. So the international community really has a role to play here, right? With expressing their preemptive support and also asking the questions of where is the Gendin Chuki Nyima, the 11th Panchen Lama? He's still missing since 1995. That's for as long as I've even been born, actually more, that His Holiness, the Panchen Lama, has been missing. And so, again, the Chinese government is trying to seek legitimacy and control both internally and externally. And the Tibetan people inside Tibet, despite all the oppression, where it's recognized as one of the least free places on earth, the Tibetan people, despite all this, are finding ways to resist the autocratic imposed government rules and regulations, where the Chinese government has appointed a fake Panchen Lama to seek legitimacy, but the Tibetan people are still resisting. So if the Tibetan people are doing that, can you just imagine how unshakable the faith and the devotion of the Tibetan people will be towards His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and the future? So while the people of Tibetan inside Tibet and in external, in exile and diaspora are doing their part, we need now the international community to do theirs, which is recognize and pass legislation to preemptively show their support for His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people.
Camilla, I mean, you mentioned, for example, the legislation that the United States has passed, for example. Do you see this kind of support happening when we look into the coming months or years? What kind of signals do you receive? I mean, we know how strong the China pressure is on so many capitals around the world, right? So what kind of movement do you see in this regard?
I'm very optimistic about the international community showing up not just for the Tibetan people, but actually for their own interest. It serves their own national interest to combat the dictatorial regimes such as the Chinese government. And why? Not just also within the national interest. I'm actually going to push the audience to think a little bit further in terms of the international context of how in the international world, do we want to see a world where we are falling towards more and more dictators, autocracies? We know very well that the autocracies are working together, right? Whether it's Maduro in Venezuela frauding the elections with the support of Xi Jinping, or anywhere else in the world where we have seen democracies either backslide or fall down because of the autocracies and dictators working together. This is at the helm of that sort of autocracy Inc., where they're working together, is actually the Chinese government. They are crafting slowly their influence, not just in North America and Europe. We're seeing that in Latin America. We've seen that in Africa. And so we see this insidious spread of the Chinese government's influence and also their virus of autocracy and dictatorship spread. And so this is a threat to anyone that appreciates living in the free world. We're not even just talking about national interest. And if we want to, we spoke about the interest of India with all the Tibetan Buddhist communities that live in the border. There is also the pressure for the US as China tries to scale its global power as for its economy, for its military power, and so forth. And uniquely, Europe sits in a place where oftentimes the talks of human rights and democracy are not as valued, said in the words, but not in action. And now Europe has an opportunity. The German government has an opportunity to step up and name it by passing legislation in their governments that show the preemptive support for the Tibetan people and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I'm optimistic because I just recently saw a video of the British Prime Minister speaking directly to dictator Xi Jinping and referencing the cases of Chemi Lhamo, which is a Hong Konger, but I see victories in these type of movements because ultimately our movements are interconnected. And for as long as we stand up to the bully of the Chinese government, we are making moves forward. And that's the direction that we must head. And so I'm optimistic because there is signs of hope, but also it serves the interest of all of our humanity and anybody who appreciates human rights, democracy, and freedom to be working in that direction.
I'd like to maybe turn to zoom in a bit more into the situation in Dharamsala. Tenzin Desela, again, it's great to have you here. Maybe you can share your perspective on what kind of signals you sense when it comes to support of international community, how they reach, or if they reach Dharamsala. And maybe in a bit of a second tier of that question, how is the Tibetan community itself prepared to navigate its relationship with China after succession?
Well, thank you, Anna, for chairing this session, and to Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for having us over. And it's a very tough act to follow after these three illustrious speakers, but nevertheless, I'll go ahead and voice my opinion. Well, once when we start thinking about Tibetan community, I think there's these two strands that we have to start thinking about, these two strands of Tibetan communities. So one that is living outside Tibet, and the Tibetans living within Tibet, which is under the colonial occupation. And just to get perspective on what has been happening in Tibet, particularly in terms of People's Republic of China's engagement with Tibet, we have to think in terms of two activities that China has been approaching Tibet. So one is state making, and another is nation building. So state making, we can think about this incredible infrastructure building, like incredible railway networks, and then particularly the ones we can think about there's this pun where people say that this is never-ending parties, so to speak. What I'm trying to get at is the fact that the CCP is pretty much in everyday life. So in everyday politics of Tibetans living inside Tibet, the party is everywhere. In every institutions you go to, down to the village level, the party is everywhere. So this is the state-making process. And in terms of nation building, what has been perhaps been one of the biggest challenges for the People's Republic of China in terms of trying to project this idea that this is People's Republic of China and Tibet is part of, quote unquote, Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. I think this idea has sort of come to a reckoning in 2008, where there was this massive protest throughout Tibet. And then Tibetans rose up and said, okay, this is, we want His Holiness to return to Tibet and we want freedom. So these are the ideas that were, this is the failure. So the point I'm trying to get at is that these two strands of Tibetan communities living inside Tibet under colonial occupation, where there's this very little breathing space in terms of voicing your opinion, but nevertheless there are many creative forms of protest and resistance that is ongoing in Tibet. And at the same time, there's this Tibetan movement in exile that came, that they were forged since we came to exile in 1959. So how, if you look at diaspora movements throughout the world, have they succeeded in making this two strands of movements cohesive in communication with each other, cohesion movement? And I think this is one of the biggest success of the Tibetan people, is that these two strands of movement are in conversation with each other, are in mirroring each other. Tibetans in exile amplifying the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet. So I think one of the singular most important figure that has been sort of coalescing and navigating these two strands of movement and then making it a cohesive movement is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, so what kind of signals are we sending from Dharamsala? And I think you can look at many diaspora movements, and there's this pertinent question about, do they represent us or not? And I think this is one of the most singular success of the Tibetans in exile, is that we have never faced this question. Tibetans' ability to represent Tibetans inside Tibet is unquestioned. I think this is one of the success stories that hasn't really been told much, and I think this is something that we have to lay our emphasis on. And in terms of what kind of messages are we sending from Dharamsala, I think the message is quite clear that His Holiness has time and again, there's this statement of 2011 where he said that once when he reaches the age of 90, there's going to be a discussion about it. So we will have to wait for a little while, not too long, but we will have to wait for a little while to get a clearer picture of what is going to pan out. But nevertheless, what is really important, and it's too early to discuss about legacy, but one of the important activity that he has demonstrated through is the devolution of his political power to elected leadership. And I think this is something that's incredibly important. And I think, of course, sometimes, our democracy, like many other democracies, do attain a level of, in terms of decibel level, it does attain, like, it can be, nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make is that it's quite really important to be able to stress test our democratic institution and to have a sustained, we need to have a deliberative institution where different ideas could be discussed, and then so institutionalization of and the transference of power and democratization is singularly, like, in terms of it's too early to discuss legacy, as I mentioned earlier, but I think it's incredibly important to think about what an important achievement it is to be able to devolve political power and then hand it over to elected leadership.
Absolutely. I have a follow-up question on what you just said in the end. Maybe before I pose my question, I would just like to remind the audience, if you have any question, we will open up the floor in a short bit. So I welcome you to just pose some questions, and we will contribute it, or we will continue to discuss it. Tenzin La, what I was just wondering is the question on on the democratization of Tibetan exile community, or the situation of democracy amongst the Tibetan community. As we all know, of course, there is this political, two political main ideas between the Umapas and the Ramtenwas, the ones who follow the path that His Holiness has also very well given forward to ask for autonomy of Tibet within the context of China, or the other question, which are much smaller, but there are voices amongst the Tibetan exile community who actually ask for independence, the Rangtenpas. So I just wanted to ask you, what is your take on this question? Maybe under a fifth, with the next Dalai Lama or with the next leader, do you think this this question could change, or this political stance could change, or how would this kind of political process evolve?
Yeah. So, so like you mentioned, there are like two dominant, I don't know, ideas to negotiate with. How do we negotiate with the People's Republic of China? And I think this is one of the reason why I keep saying that this institutionalization of transference of power that His Holiness has achieved, I think is quite incredible, in the sense that we need to have this deliberative institution where different ideas could be thrashed out, but nevertheless there's this institutional framework that could sustain the movement. And I think one thing that perhaps I think if you look at People's Republic of China, I think it's a real fact that confronting this asymmetry of power between the Tibetans and the People's Republic of China, the asymmetry is quite huge. And I think it is dawning on many of us that, the struggle perhaps is not going to end anytime soon, but the struggle has to be sustained. And how do we sustain this movement? I think for exiled Tibetans to have this cohesive, cogent movement and to be able to mirror the voices of Tibetans in Tibet. And I think it's quite important to have this institution where we can have this deliberative framework within the exiled Tibetan community where differences of opinions could be debated. And I think what His Holiness has done, I think it was in early 1990s and 2000s, he was able to see through, and then to be able to put those institutions in place, I think is quite incredible. So I think for Tibetans in exile, I think it's quite important to recognize that these institutions, if Tibetan movement has to be sustained, these institutions where this deliberative framework, it has to be sustained. And I think any of those ideas could be discussed within that framework. So if we can have that kind of framework, I think the movement can be sustained.
Thank you. So I'm looking. We have one question from Tenzin Damjul of the FNVA, the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives. She's asking a question that we have already touched upon to some extent, but I'm thinking maybe Geshe-la, maybe he can give us a bit of more context on how this process works. Tenzin Damjul is asking, do you think the Central Tibetan Administration is the political successor of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, given it was a major vision of his in setting up this very democratic transition? Geshe-la, do you see, I mean, you've been around, you have been part of these kind of transition processes now. Do you see a direct transition between the political power of His Holiness to the CTA?
Yeah, I mean, His Holiness has already transferred his power. In 2011, when he devolved his power, he clearly said that now, before that he said, I have retired. Since many years, he said, now you need to take the responsibility. It's amazing that you have so much, trust in me, but it is risky and dangerous to trust just to one person. The political leadership should be elected democratically. And then gradually in 2011, as we all recall, that he has devolved his power and given the power to Central Tibetan administration. And elsewhere also, His Holiness clearly said that it doesn't look nice for a religious leader to be the political head also. So he's not at all interested in, a religious figure being the head of the Tibetan government, particularly in this modern age. So therefore, I would say he has already transferred his power to the CTA, political leadership, the Sichong and so forth. So therefore, because of his decision much in advance, I think we got good time to already prepare. And the Sichong, whether it's Lobsang Singhi or Pemba Tsering, they have been doing their successive tours around the world and making connection with the rest of the world, different countries. So I think we are doing quite well. Of course, there are many, many concerns because you can't expect people to pay the same devotion to the Sichongs as they have been doing with His Holiness because he's a religious head. But in a way, that may be even more convenient for people to raise their voices, ask direct questions, which they may not be able to do to His Holiness because of their great reverence. So if there is a leader elected through democratic process and not a religious leader, then I think there is actually more opportunity for, share their concerns, ask the relevant questions. So we are really, I think, as His Holiness vision, and through that process, we are really now moving into the proper process of practice of democracy. So then we have the parliament, which His Holiness vision so many, many years back. So now it is up to the Tibetans, Tibetan, not only the leadership, but the Tibetan community to know how important this responsibility that is given to us. And as many had voiced, to remain united and to see our goal clearly and to preserve our language, culture, identity, and so forth. So there we need to really work very, very hard. So otherwise, His Holiness has done his job.
That's a really good point. Maybe just to quickly follow up, I would be interested what your views are when you say that people that they have more room to voice their concerns. What do you think concerns are these days that people maybe feel more free about?
Concern is like many, we are ordinary human beings, so we all make mistakes. It's not just Tibetans, everywhere, For example, the very process of democracy, it is written in the political science that democracy, when it's given in the hand of educated people, then it is democracy of the people, by the people, for the people. But it is given to, uneducated people, then it's government of the cattle, by the cattle, for the cattle, you see. So there's a really risk of going towards that direction. Because to be honest, majority of the people really have not much idea about what is democracy, what is middle way, what is non-violence. They are not very, very informed, ordinary people. You can't expect, illiterate, ordinary people. They're busy with their day-to-day work. So we need to, develop more political awakening and political consciousness. That is very, very important because when we, challenge the wrongdoings of the Chinese government, the answer to that is not just praying, it's political activism, to be able to defend our very right and correct whoever is making the mistakes. Now, for example, there was a time when China said Tibet is part of China. And then the rest of the world, unfortunately, the rest of the world followed what China said because of, business purposes. They all repeated the mantra, Tibet is part of China, Tibet is part of China, not knowing that China is repeating this mantra because they know Tibet is not part of China. Therefore, they have to say Tibet is part of China, Tibet is part of China, Tibet is part of China. If Tibet is part of China, it's a given fact. They don't have to repeat this. So now we need to request people, please, don't say that. Don't say that. And now gradually, like as the US Congress has accepted, there is no document, proving that Tibet is part of China. Now they've started saying this. So hopefully there will be more kind of awakening among the rest of the country, rest of the world, and say the right thing. So that is very, very important. So awakening, whether it's a religious awakening, whether it's a political awakening, whether it's awakening on Tibetan culture, importance of Tibetan language, there we need to really, really work very hard. And this is my personal feeling and personal concern also, because the very identity of Tibetan people is deliberately destroyed by China, as we already discussed. Now it befalls on the shoulder of Tibetans in exile to work doubly hard or three times hard to preserve this. So that's what I'm saying. Then the second thing is harmony among Tibetans. Because of His Holiness's great leadership and also due to the leadership of some other religious great teachers, the harmony was quite good. But now, unfortunately, when people get scattered to different countries, then sometimes the tribal mentality comes up, and then focusing more about the individual, the regionalism, forget about the bigger issue. Our conflict is with China, not among us. We are driven away from our country by China, not by any of the people from different provinces or the four religious schools. Not from that. We are all driven away by China. So we need to remember just that, right? And remain united, and then preserve our culture. And I have been saying, I said this yesterday also during one occasion, that you need to do just few things. Don't worry if you have a small population. We are living in the digital age, you don't need a big population, right? Population is actually extra burden, extra problem, you see. Even if there is a fight, many more people will be killed, that's the problem with the big population. Okay. So therefore, what really we need to know is two things. One, as His Holiness has been suggesting, be ethical, be nice to everybody, make friendship to everybody, and preserve your culture and your very special, precious language, and then remain united. You need to just do these two things. If you preserve your, good culture and remain united, you will outlast the Chinese dictatorial system. Because the dictatorial system, it is not founded on solid basis. It is founded on oppression, power, blind faith, and people don't like that. On and off, we do get those information from China itself right now, right? So therefore, it will not last long. So when it starts crumbling, Tibetans should have already made the preparation to go back to their country and handle everything. So the question is, are we prepared? I will not say not prepared, but we need to do a lot of work in this area. That's what I think. Yeah.
I want to quickly jump in here.
Yeah, I saw, Chemi, you wanted to say something. Yeah.
I wanted to say that, as someone who's been born third generation stateless in India, who's never seen Tibet, and grew up in the West, on behalf of, and if I may speak on behalf of some young folks, young people, specifically Tibetan youngsters that have only dreamt about being able to see His Holiness be in his rightful position in the Potala Palace, are united. We are constantly engaging in various campaigns that are, by following the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, trying to be 21st century Buddhists by engaging in strategic nonviolent actions wherever we are. We're waging strategic campaigns against not just the Chinese government directly by combating their propaganda and lies that they're spreading, whether it's in the French Museum or in Budapest, where they're trying to spread lies by speaking of modernization, but then really just trying to erase Tibet out of every encyclopedia, dictionary that one can imagine, libraries. We are not only challenging the Chinese government directly, we are challenging every form of repression that the Chinese government is exporting in various parts of the world. In the US just recently, we have put out a transnational repression report that is over 140 pages that has been solidified in terms of the findings by Washington Post with their 6-month investigation. So the young people are here, they are organizing, they are ready. Yes, there's a lot to prepare for, and we recognize the challenge that is ahead of us, and we are constantly trying to upskill ourselves, and we are giving the institutions that His Holiness, because of His Holiness's visionary leadership, we have systems and institutions in place that will hold us together during the times when it will be rough. And not only are they secure in what they do, the youngsters, the Tibetan people have also accepted, and not only accepted, they believe, despite differences in opinion. And earlier you asked a question of, difference in opinions of whether they're Uma or Rangzan. It actually doesn't matter. It is ultimately coming down to the point that Tibetan people have the right to decide their own future. And when it comes to that question, the right to self-determination for the Tibetan people is a universal right. And so with that said, any institution or system continues to stay in power, or at least it should, with the political legitimacy that they have from the people. And for us, whether we have a country where we have the land right now or not, where we're in exile, the institutions that are in place where the transfer of power from His Holiness has happened to the Central Tibetan Administration, there is the political legitimacy. They are the representatives of the young people that we speak. They are the representatives of the Tibetans inside of Tibet for as long as, until we are reunited in a free Tibet.
When we look into the last few years, there has been cases where also high lamas, when there was an issue about reincarnation, where there would have been a split, that there would have been two of these lamas. Is there any discussion actually amongst, and forgive my ignorance, so to say, but is there any discussion amongst Tibetans in exile who would be worried about the fact that there might be even a third His Holiness, or a third Dalai Lama, in a sense, that there might be a split also within the exile community on that question? Is there any discussion on that? Let's phrase like that.
No, if you are talking about the two reincarnations of Karmapa,
for example,
for example, then the President Karmapa Ujjintile, he with his foresight, he approached the other Karmapa, and they got together in France and said, let us work together for Dharma. The purpose is for Dharma, nothing else. So that, I think, that has solved already all the problems. So in the case of His Holiness, I don't really expect that there will be among the Tibetan community in exile, another candidate saying that I am the Dalai Lama. I don't see that. The Chinese, of course, deceitfulness act will always be there, but I don't give a damn to that, because we always know whatever the China is saying is basically a lie and nothing else. So then of course we need to see these kind of problems on a larger perspective. In any human society, one or the other problems are bound to come up. So we should not be scared of that. We live in an ordinary human society. So we should always try to solve that through dialogue, through negotiation, through human way, and I think we can handle all those problems.
We have another question from the audience. Somebody from the audience is writing to us: the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama has been an ongoing topic of discussion for many years now. The presence of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has been the driving security for Tibetan community in particular, and many other communities as a whole. So I would like to ask, what risk would be imposed on Tibetans during the intermediate period when His Holiness is no longer with us, but till the appointment of his successor? I'm wondering, maybe Tenzin Desela, do you want to jump in here, or maybe Professor Kumar? Do we
Professor
see any?
Anand, do you want to take this if he's around? If not, then perhaps I can put in my 2 cents worth. But Professor Anand, do you want to go ahead?
The reality is there before us that when there will be reincarnation identified, he or she may be a child who will take a few years to mature, and that will be a great transition time. And as Geshe-la said, they are mentally preparing themselves for that transition period. But there is already a kind of training of the Tibetan people by the Dalai Lama himself when he allowed for a referendum where more than 85% people said that they trust the Dalai Lama's wisdom and judgment, and whatever he suggests is our position, and that is in favor of middle path. But around 10 to 15% people were thinking of some other solutions which were not exactly around the line of middle path. So that kind of plurality of perspectives is not going to be a new situation. Dalai Lama ji has guided them to learn to live with differences and agree with the majority. Secondly, there is going to be some kind of gap of perception between people inside Tibet and people outside Tibet. And even among those who are outside Tibet, there'll be one position taken by people living in India, and there will be a separate perception among the people, Tibetan diaspora in Europe and America, because European and American reception of the Dalai Lama's campaign has been more positive, more visible than it was in India. India has always offered a subdued kind of support at the official level. So there will be difference of expectations in terms of the support system, but living with plurality of perspectives is going to be something like a good quality for the Tibetan campaign for autonomy and survival. I also want to underline the fact that the middle path based approach also created an opening of dialogue with the Tibetans, between Tibetans and the Chinese. And there were 8 rounds of dialogues. So as the Buddhists believe that reality is ever changing, we have to know that if there's going to be a transition in the Tibetan community in terms of the institution of the Dalai Lama, there's going to be transition with Tibetan Communist Party and Tibetan military system also. And who knows, it may implode. So there are many possibilities from very pessimistic to very optimistic. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. If I can quickly jump in, I think
Yes, please.
one of the things that we can perhaps look into is the fact that our Exile Tibetan movement, like I mentioned earlier, has been rather cohesive. It has been able to mirror the movement within Tibet. So there's this huge conversation going on, and in terms of just as a political movement, how can we sustain this movement for the restoration of freedom movement for the Tibetan people? And I think it's quite important to have this understanding that institutionalization and democratization of Tibetan movement is a platform which is of immense import, in a sense that this forms a deliberative format where like many of these concerns that has raised through this presentation about what is going to happen to differences of Tibetan diaspora dispersing into different parts of the world. So if we have this deliberative format in Dharamsala, in India, this is going to be an incredibly important fulcrum through which we can sustain the movement.
I'm looking a bit at the time. We still have a few minutes, so I'm wondering maybe it would be a good idea to close with the question that maybe everybody can give a bit of an idea of what you think of, is the fact that China has been rising for many years, and the People's Republic of China is not going to stop from being a very influential, some people call it superpower country in the world. What do you see would be important for the Tibetan community to do in order to remain noticeable and not to be forgotten, in a sense? And that also, of course, includes the question of the succession of His Holiness. Maybe Professor Kumar, would you like to start?
The reality has to be communicated. So Tibetans have developed a very effective and sophisticated system of communication now, multilingual, multimedia. There has to be continuity of communication, communication, and communication. If you keep the word informed, they will maintain their consistency. But if there is confusion, fake news, and all those distortions, which is possible with the new technology, then Tibetans will become helpless. So I think that the supreme responsibility of the Tibetan community in exile is to maintain a clear line of communication and bring in as many details as possible about the transition, which is already in the makings for last 14 or 15 years. So I will say that power of communication has to be cultivated as much as possible. Thank you.
Gisela, what is your take on that question? How can Tibet?
When His Holiness devolved his power, I think it was after 1 or 2 days, I had a chance to see him. And His Holiness asked me, what do you think my decision of devolving the political power? And with tears in my eyes, said, His Holiness, you did the right thing, because we cannot expect all the time to rely upon you. That is my answer at that time also. I think that also right now. So I think there's a little bit of confusion between His Holiness's what will happen after His Holiness. So one is, when we talk about what will happen after His Holiness, we are talking about just his reincarnation as a spiritual leader. We are not talking about how the Tibetan government will, run or things like that. We need to separate this. Then you ask a second question saying, okay, what will happen with the Tibetan administration, Tibetan government after His Holiness is gone? So that as I already mentioned, that His Holiness has several times mentioned, you need to start function right now as if I'm not there. He said this many times. And to some extent, we have been doing this. Yes, because of His Holiness's great stature and people's trust in him, there will be initially some setback, but that's the ordinary human story. There will be setbacks, ups and downs all the time. But I think we will learn more, because if you get the responsibility, you'll get more headache, but you will know how to handle things slowly. So we need to really accept this, to take the responsibility faithfully. And I want to conclude by saying that when Buddha was passing away, and his followers surrounding him and crying and weeping, saying that now when you are gone, then the sun is gone, there will be darkness all over. So we would request you to appoint a representative. Then Buddha did not appoint any one person as his representative. He said, when I'm gone, this is my teaching, meaning that when I'm gone, my representative is my teaching. So now His Holiness has given so many guidance, so many lectures, so many teachings. It runs over several hundreds of books. His guidance is always there. Now, if Tibetans are, honest enough, good enough, intelligent enough, we need to just listen to all these guidances that is already there in black and white, and follow that. And imagine, if you are a true believer, that His Holiness is something very special. He will not disappear forever. Just like the Buddha that we are thinking about today, he is no more physically, but His Holiness will be seen like a Buddha, and we'll remember his teachings, his guidances, and follow it. There's no problem.
Maybe very briefly, Chemi, and then also Gisela, do you want to also find some concluding words to that?
Following Gisela, I was thinking, when a young person moves out for college or wherever else, their parents' teachings continue to stay with them. And likewise, I'm sure that the Tibetan people will have challenges. There will be things where you're like calling up your mom and dad, figuring out how to do things, but you figure out a way. And it feels like the world has continued to build amazing adults. So we'll be fine. Of course, it'll be challenging, but we'll be okay, is what I think. But I want to add as a response to your question, Anna, is that the Tibetan people, the question of being forgotten, I think it doesn't even come to my mind. The reason being, one, the Tibetan people have preserved the Dharma, the three jewels, that for anybody in this world that will continue to exist in our various realms, the Dharma serves, whether if you think about it in a religious and spiritual perspective, or if you think about it even in a very secular perspective. The teachings of love, compassion, wisdom is universal. And so that's not something that I think will ever leave from our world. And likewise, the Tibetan people's culture that they have preserved, the Dharma that they've preserved, will also continue to serve for end of time. And then in addition to that, what I think from a political stand of view, what is important is solidarity and allyship of the international community. Right? These are the friends that we need when we move out. When your parents are not picking up the call, it's okay. There's an auntie, there's an uncle, there's friends that come out to your support, and they'll come. And we recognize that we don't live in this world alone. And our teachings have taught us that we are interconnected and that we can rely on the support of the international community, because they will come to support us. And not only like support us in the sense that we need that support. I want to emphasize another role that the Tibetan people play, which is having a partnership with the international community. Why? Because Chinese government is a threat, not just to the Tibetan people, but to the international community. And the Tibetan people are very well versed in dealing with the Chinese government. We have faced their oppression. Despite facing their oppression, look at us. We are a model refugee community. We have democracy without borders. We are an example for the international community to strive for. And so with that said, we come as not just a community that is asking for support. We come as a community that can offer our partnership in dealing with your national security issues, but also challenging the Chinese government alongside the Autocracy Inc. to be able to have a more free world.
Gisela?
Yep, right. Certainly. So if you look at the short history of how Tibet is being represented in international media and in how Tibet is received by the international community, and at the same time, if you look at the short history of how China is received and represented in international media and how China is received in international community, and it has gone through various phases. It has ebbs, it has flows, and it has gone through various transitory phases. But what is really important, if you look at Free Tibet movement, quote unquote Free Tibet movement, it was incredibly popular in one particular period of time, and it sort of waned, and then now, so it's quite difficult to actually say that whether Tibetan is going to be a function of how Tibetans are represented in international media or it's received by the international community. And I think for me, the more important question is how Tibetan movement is sustained by the Tibetan people. And I think this is why I keep coming back to the question of having this deliberative format where differences of opinions could be threshed out so that we can have this sustained movement, these institutions that we have built over here. Geshe-la and everybody talked about the foresight of His Holiness to devolve the political power and have this sustained institutions of democracy where ideas and differences could be deliberated. A deliberative format is there, so that at least so in order for us to sustain this moment, these are the questions that, for me, it is of more concern than how Tibetans is received by the international community. For me, what is more important is the sustenance of those democratic institutions and how Tibetan movement is sustained by the Tibetan people. And how can we continue to have this conversation between the Tibetans living in diaspora and the Tibetans living inside Tibet. And I think if we can have this conversation going, if this conversation is cogent, cohesive, and I think we can still continue to have this long-sustained movement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And as we could see today, the movement is thriving. The communication between Tibetans is thriving. And also with people like me from the international community, I really learned a lot. As Geshe-la has also said, there's no need to be scared of anything. And this is definitely one point I will take away from this discussion we've had, amongst many others. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights. And I would like to end by thanking again the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung and to maybe invite its director, the great Dr. Carsten Klein, to maybe find some concluding words. But thank you so much from my side.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to all of you. It was really extremely impressive to be part of that, and it clearly shows the Tibetan issue is the right way. And again, this event has shown clearly the people who are supporting the Tibetan ideas, the Tibetan psychology, also the spiritual convictions, and the political and the democratic movement, including the institutions. You are on the very right side. So thank you very much again, Mrs. Weser, representing many liberals in the German Bundestag who are also sharing the Tibetan cause. Thanks, Pempa, of course, for your guidance and your friendship. Venerable Geshe-la, I would be very, very happy to see you again soon here in Delhi and perhaps also in Germany. Professor Kumar, thank you very, very much for giving us this excellent position from the Indian side. India is the largest democracy on earth, and Tibetan democracy in the Indian Tibetan democracy is just the very, very right way. Mrs. Sabathal, thank you very much for your commitment. And of course, dear Mr. Lhamo and dear Mrs. Lhamo and dear Mr. Desal, for bringing in these extremely relevant points. I'm really convinced that good quality journalism, for example, which spreads the news of this democratic movement, but also initiatives like the International Campaign for Tibet, Mr. Müller and the colleagues there, but also the Deutsche Nepal-Gesellschaft, the Deutsche Bhutan-Gesellschaft, and many others. You are all supporting this very positive, great, and right way of the democratic movement and transition in Tibet and far beyond that as well. And let me, coming myself from the parliamentarian background, say one other thing, and that was also mentioned by Geshe-la and Professor Kumar. This is so extremely important, and Mrs. Lhamo, that we bring in many more actors from the parliaments, from the lawmaking institutions to bring a clear strategy and a clear stance on the Tibetan affair for the future. And it is also extremely important for civic society to bring in this Tibetan issue in the schools, have it more discussed in the universities and amongst the normal people also on the streets. Because learning from that course gives everyone an additional, very positive thought perspective on democratic values and a democratic movement. So thank you very much, dear friends and colleagues, especially thank you to Hess and Rhineland-Palatinate office in Germany. I know that we have very many German followers, European followers there, Mr. Walz and Mrs. Els. Thank you very much for Tibetan CTA and our direct partner SAT for these years of permanent excellent collaboration. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. from our own Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, dear Mrs. Nupur, Tashi, and all the other friends here. Thank you. Without your permanent commitment, that would not be possible in a quite small foundation. We, as the Liberal Foundation from Germany, we stand amidst you, the Tibetans. We did that in the last 35 years, and we will definitely do it also in the next upcoming decades. And be assured, whatever we could do, we are happy to do it for and with the Tibetans. And again, we are very, very convinced that being together with the Tibetans, we are on the very right side. Thank you very much to you all. That was one webinar. We will have a series of continuous next webinars and other events on the Tibetan issue. Please stay informed. Also stay critical with us by sharing your attitudes and new and fresh ideas on social media with us. Thank you very much. We will have got some upcoming interesting events. I wish you all a very perfect evening and a very good night. Thank you very much. Tashi Derek, and seeing you all